Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. Tonight we're going to be talking about King Saul, a king like other nations have. And you might have noticed if you're on the email list that I numbered it wrong. It is not Samuel lesson 6, this is Samuel lesson number 7. Good evening, Mike and Kim. Yeah, please say hi. If you're comfortable, let us know where you're watching from. Love to know who is here. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always shoot them to me in an email. And when I get those in the mail, I don't get them very often, but when I do always address them. And I will not share your name unless you say so. Hey, Judy, good to have you here. Barbara, hey, Barbara, good to have you here tonight. We're doing a survey of the Bible, one important story at a time each week, going straight through. If you'd like to get the paraphrased version of the story in your email, just send me an email to the address on your screen, and I will be happy to put you on the list to get that every week. Roseanne is with us tonight. Good evening, Roseanne. Thank you for joining us. If you haven't already liked the YouTube channel, or subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do that. Don't forget to like the video, and if you're watching on Facebook, please like the video there too. And of course, if you think it's really good, you could share it with someone you might think would be interested in it. Tracy is here. Welcome. Good to have you here, Tracy. So, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started with our story. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Oh, lots of more people. Okay, we got Charles here. We got Stella here. We got Rob, Tony, and Jean here from Sandgates. Welcome. Down in St. Mary's County on the water, near two great restaurants. John Ewan, good to have you here tonight. All right, so tonight, 1 Samuel chapter 9 and a few verses from the beginning of chapter 10. Did I say verse 9? 1 Samuel chapter 9 and a few verses from the beginning of we're going to try this one more time. 1 Samuel chapter 9 and a few verses from the beginning of chapter 10. Maybe if I just could slow down, speak up, and articulate like they taught me to, I could say things. New member William. Welcome, William. Glad to have you here. Hello, Sandy. All right, so let's talk about King Saul. There was a rich man from the tribe of Benjamin whose name was Kish. He had a son named Saul, who was an impressive young man. He was handsome, and he stood head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. One day, Kish's donkeys wandered off. He told Saul to take a servant and go looking for them. And they searched all over, Ephraim, Shalishah, Shalem, and their homeland, but they didn't find them. When they reached the land of Zuph, Saul said, "We should head back now. By now my father is more worried about us than the donkeys." And the servant replied, "There's a man of God in town there. He's famous for being right about everything. Let's go ask him which way we should go." And Saul said, "But we don't have anything to offer him. We didn't bring any gifts, and we're out of food. Do we have anything else?" The servant said, "I have a silver quarter. We can give him that." Saul replied, "Sounds like a plan. Let's go." So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they climbed up the hill to the town, they came across some young women on their way to fetch water. They asked them, "Is the seer in town?" In those days, prophets were called seers. They said, "Yes, he's just ahead of you. He's headed into town because he has a sacrifice to officiate today. Nobody can eat until he blesses it. If you go straight ahead, you can't miss him." When they reached the town, they ran right into Samuel. He was headed for the high place. The Lord had already talked to Samuel about Saul. The day before, he'd said, "About this time tomorrow, I'm sending you a man from the tribe of Benjamin. Anoint him to lead Israel. I'm sending him to save my people from the Philistines, because I've heard their cries." When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said, "That's him. He will lead my people." Saul went up to Samuel and asked where the seer was. Samuel said, I am the seer. Come to the sacrifice and eat with me. In the morning I'll tell you everything you need to know and send you on your way. Don't worry about the donkeys, they've already been found, and everything in Israel belongs to you now anyway. Saul replied, What are you talking about? I'm from Benjamin, the smallest tribe in the country, and my family is the weakest family in the tribe. Samuel took them into the great hall and seated them at the head table. There were about 30 people there. Samuel had the best cut of meat given to Saul, and they ate together. Afterward, they went up on Samuel's balcony to talk. They got up early the next day, and Samuel called up to them, Get up, so I can get you started on your way. When they were ready to head out, Saul sent the servant on ahead so they could speak privately. Samuel sent the servant on ahead. Samuel said, Let me tell you God's message for you. He anointed Saul's head with oil and said, The Lord has anointed you to lead his people. When you pass Rachel's tomb on the way home, you'll come across 2 men. They'll tell you that the donkeys have been found. Now you're the one who's missing and making everyone anxious. When you pass the oak of Tabor, you'll meet 3 men. They'll be traveling with 3 young goats, 3 loaves of bread, and a skin full of wine. They will offer you 2 of the loaves. Take them. Finally, when you reach Gibeah, the hill of God, you'll meet a band of prophets coming down from the high place. They'll be playing lutes, tambourines, and harps, and they'll be in a prophetic frenzy. The Spirit of the Lord will seize you and transform you into a new man. Let it happen, because God is with you. I'll meet you at Gilgal in 7 days. We'll offer burnt offerings and peace offerings together. Everything happened exactly as Samuel said it would. God changed Saul's heart. He met the band of prophets and fell into a prophetic frenzy with them. His friends all asked, What's come over him? Is Saul a prophet now? And someone answered, Sure, why not? Any family can produce a prophet. But all the people asked, How can Saul be a prophet? And the saying caught on. When Saul's frenzy ended, he went home. This is the word of our Lord. Sorry for that typo there. I ended the quote when I should not have. So you probably didn't hear the ambulance go by just now, but I did. All right, let's talk about this chapter 8 mostly. Well, actually, a lot of what I have to say is actually about those few verses from the beginning of chapter 9. We're going to talk about chapter 9, but a lot of what I'm going to say is about the first few verses of chapter 10. Back in chapter 8, last week, we heard nothing but bad stuff about the idea of having a king for Israel. Nothing good to say about kings at all. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who are new, sacrifices like this, it's best to understand them as a highly ritualized meal. In the ancient world, you couldn't buy meat in a store. You had to take an animal and kill it and then butcher it and then cook it. And the whole family would participate in all of this. Well, in a sacrifice, all the same things happen, except those things happen at a holy place, and a priest or a prophet, or in this case, a judge in the early days, they would participate in that. In the butchering and in the cooking and everything, and a portion would be given to God and burnt up on the altar, and the family would eat the rest of it together as a sacred meal. That's what's going on here. Saul hasn't brought anything. He's stumbled onto this sacrifice and is participating in it with them. So in chapter 8, we heard nothing good about what it means to be a king. We heard nothing good about kings, and here in chapter 9. We hear nothing bad about kings. If you weren't with us last week, if you didn't read chapter 9, you would not know that God was upset about the idea of picking a king for Israel. And we said last week that there were likely 2 schools of thought in Israel. Some people thought that picking a king was the worst thing that had ever happened to Israel. Others thought that it was a necessary step in Israel's evolution into a nation. And certainly, the lineage of King David is celebrated throughout the Old Testament. Once we get to King David, we're not going to hear any more questions about whether or not kings are a good idea or a bad idea, whether or not following a king means that you've rejected God's kingship. So, here in chapter 9, God is selecting Saul to be a king, and it is made clear that Saul is the ideal sort of person to be a king, as the other nations understand the job description of king. He is handsome, he is tall. We're going to find out later that he's a good military strategist. He's good at a lot of different things that we would generally say kings need to be good at. But what do we make of this experience that Saul has with the prophets? So Saul is sent back home, and he's told, you're going to encounter some prophets, and he does. And when he encounters those prophets, he has a religious experience of some sort. Now, some people see this as a straightforward story of Saul having a religious experience and being sort of born again. This wasn't a Christian conversion because Christianity didn't exist yet, but it was, a conversion type of experience, or a reformative experience, or a formative experience. It was a big thing that happened to Saul, and he was a changed person after that. And the text makes clear that God's Spirit has a hand in this, right? Well, others see in this something a little bit darker. Some see something a lot darker in it. And it's because they're interpreting this story having already read it through to the end. And sometimes that's a good idea, and sometimes it's not a good idea. The people who were with Saul, who witnessed this event, did not have a positive reaction to what happened. Okay, that's clear in the story. They think he's fallen in with the nut jobs, but pretty much. And apparently the Hebrew wording makes it a bit more clear. Some scholars say that the Hebrew wording suggests that this band of prophets is looked down on as being low class, whereas Saul, despite whatever he said about being from a weak family, is from a rich family. And people are saying, hey, a man of this stature shouldn't be hanging out with these people, let alone going into a prophetic frenzy with them. And just like today, some people have certain attitudes about charismatic religious experiences, and some people have very different other ideas about that. Some people consider them a blessing. Some people consider them to be pure emotionalism. So these guys are not having a positive interpretation of what is going on with Saul. And other scholars today see in this story basically the beginning of the decline of Saul's mental health. They say that this frenzy is not an actual spiritual experience, but that when he falls into these prophets, he has his first psychotic episode, of which there will be many more. And it is very clear that over the course of Saul's story, his mental health does deteriorate. He is prone to violent mood swings. He is prone to doing things that are completely irrational when he's, Mr. Hyde. So, is the Holy Spirit a part of this event or not? Now, the story says it is. Okay, so we've all seen charismatic people on television, right? I mean, at least a lot of us have. Not so much on broadcast TV these days, I guess. I mean, I don't have an antenna really. I don't know. Well, I have an antenna, but it picks up one channel here in Hagerstown. I cut the cord years ago, and I don't subscribe to any of the streaming big religious networks because of this. We've all seen the charismatic preachers on TV with. My brother Mike says, you always know when a pastor has gone off the deep end because they start developing these intense relationships with their own hair. The big hair preachers. We've all seen them. And we've seen some of them speak in tongues on television. And when they do, they're not speaking Greek, they're not speaking Hebrew, they're not speaking Aramaic, they're speaking gibberish. We've heard people on TV or on YouTube is the place to go these days, by the way. You want to see this stuff these days, you got to go to YouTube. We've all seen them make prophecies that did not come to pass. We've seen these people, sometimes these same people, we see them in the news when they've had complete mental breakdowns, or they've committed a crime, they've been arrested, maybe they've been abusive, or maybe they've been opportunistic. They've made a lot of money. A lot of people have lost a lot of money. And it would be easy to say that these guys are frauds, that they're shrewd, and that it's all an act that they're using to defraud people. It would also be easy to say that they're just plain crazy, and that whatever voices they're experiencing, whatever voices they're hearing is not the voice of God. It's not a true religious experience. It's just the voice of mental illness in their heads. We don't know that. And that's the most uncomfortable part about religiosity in America today, is because you see all these high-profile cases, and it is not the case that they're all acting. Now, I'm convinced that some of them really are shrewd actors, okay? But many of them believe their own lies. And of the ones who are crazy, we don't know that God is not speaking to them. God talks to crazy people. God talks to shrewd, cunning business people. God speaks to everyone, right? Because we're all crazy in one way or another. We've all done things we shouldn't have done. God talks to us. We don't know. See, that's the thing. It's all mixed up in the soup. Okay. So when we see people like Saul or modern-day televangelists, the story tells us that God did, in fact, touch Samuel. And later on in the story, Saul. We know that God touched Saul. We also know that Saul is sliding into insanity. Did God's touch cause the insanity? No, I don't believe that at all. So, to me, another disturbing element of this story is that you could take all of that to mean that, well, God set Saul up to fail. God picked a nut job so that everybody could see what happens when you have a nut job for a king. You could say that God picked the exact wrong person to lead Israel just so the people would know why they shouldn't want the same kind of kings that the other nations have. You could read the story that way, but I think we should withhold judgment on that and not go out there thinking that, the old saying, everybody has a purpose. Your purpose is to serve as a bad example. Yeah, I don't think we should assume that God goes around doing that to people. The biblical writers recorded these stories after the events happened, and they were asking themselves prayerfully the same questions about these events that we are asking now about these recordings, these stories of these events. Questions like, what does this story tell us about God? Well, God talks to people, not always in a voice that could be mistaken for madness, not always in a voice at all, not typically in a voice, I would say. God sometimes sends people visions, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in other ways. God chooses people, and God conveys that choice through other people. God didn't say to Saul, hey, Saul, I've chosen you. God told Samuel, I've chosen Saul. And that is very much the way it continues to work for this day. Usually it is the people around somebody who sees the divine spark in them, not themselves. And yes, we see the divine spark in people who have all kinds of flaws, whether they're moral flaws or mental flaws. God touches people, and God chooses some of those people. So what does this story tell us about ourselves? That we have to tell people when God chooses them, and sometimes we have to create the environments where people can have intimate experiences of God. Saul had his Paul was a different Saul. Future King Saul had his religious experience surrounded by prophets who were, and these were not the kinds of prophets like Samuel. These were a different kind that were charismatic types. That was the environment that Saul needed to experience God's touch. We all need to be the Samuels. We all need to be the prophet types in the story. Or at least these people need to exist. What does this story tell us about our relationships then with God and each other? Knowing how this story ends is going to color our interpretation of what's going on here. I don't see any way around that. So we know that Saul is not a good king. We know that he is ultimately rejected by God because of things he did while he was king. We know that he eventually goes insane. So why then did God choose him? Did God make a mistake? Did God choose someone to serve as a cautionary tale? Not knowing the mind of God, I can't say no, I don't believe God does that. I can say no, I don't believe God does that. I just can't say that my belief is definitively true, right? I think it's more likely that God touches us and inspires us, but then we make choices, sometimes subconscious choices, sometimes very conscious choices, that can turn those blessings that were meant to empower us into burdens or even curses that drag us down. So all of us being morally compromised, all of us being mentally unsound, God blesses us and gives us gifts, gives us talents, gives us divine direction. And then what we do with that is our responsibility. And the choices we make can make the difference between being a good king and a bad king, or being a sane king or a mad king. That's where I'm going to land on this today. I don't think I said yet hello to Sandy yet or to Kayleen yet. Welcome. Glad to have you here tonight. So just a little bit to talk about in the news this week. I had a great day with the Hark today. Hark being the Hagerstown Area Religious Council. And today our guest speaker was our police chief here in Hagerstown. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, so I won't try. It's Kifer. Is that Kiffer or Kifer? I don't know. Probably Kifer. And he shared some interesting stuff. One is that apparently he used to come to those meetings all the time, but less so since he became chief. He used to be captain. He's been chief for 6 years now, and since the pandemic, things have been busier because he has nowhere near the staffing level that he used to have. That was one of the things he told us about today. He's budgeted for 90 people right now. He doesn't have 90 people, and some of the people he's got are still in training. And when they get out of training, he's got other people that are going to retire. So he needs more people. He's going to be starting a podcast soon. I was very impressed with him. Very talkative, very easy to talk to. Very much feels that God has put him in this job that he would not have chosen if he had not been nudged in that direction, but can't imagine doing anything else now. Very invested in community policing. He was talking about what he needs churches to do right now, which is he's starting up a basketball league, and he's going to specifically target for membership in this league not at-risk youth. He says we're not going to use that phrase here anymore. He wants to use the phrase crossroads youth. Youth are at a crossroads where they're at an age and a place where they're going to be making decisions that are going to impact their lives for years to come, if not forever. And those are the kids that are he's trying to get into this basketball league, and he wants them to come to practice, and he wants them to play games, and he wants their parents to come with them. And that means he needs the parents to bring their children because they don't have childcare. And that means he needs churches to recruit volunteers to help with the children, the younger children. This is a middle school age basketball thing he's talking about. He's going to need church volunteers to help supervise the children at these middle school basketball games. And he's shooting for 3 games a week, and that getting that many volunteers together, that's a pretty tall order. But we'll do what we can, and we'll get the word out as soon as he gets that information up online. He did want us to know the crime is down in Hagerstown, and that's great. He said their clearance rate on major crimes is quite high. And murders in particular, their murder rate, the rate at which they solve them is spectacularly high. But of course, you don't want to be successful solving them. You don't want to have them, and all of those numbers are coming down, which was great. And he pointed out, one of the big concerns people had this time last year was the dirt bike problem we had here in Hagerstown, and the ATVs going around in the middle of the night. Open pipe, unlicensed riders, and traveling at high rates of speed, sometimes in alleys where it was more dangerous. Anyway, those of you who live in Hagerstown know exactly what I'm talking about. And he pointed out it's been a lot more quiet this summer than it was last summer, and he's right. It has been a lot more quiet, and the reason is because they got those new drones in the air, and a lot of what he talked about today was about drones and all the different ways they use them. So one person asked about the privacy concerns about having drones in the air, and he pointed out to us that under U.S. law right now, it is understood that the Constitution does not guarantee privacy overhead. We are guaranteed privacy in our homes, but not in our yards. So if we have an 8-foot privacy fence around our backyard, and our neighbor wants to climb up in a tree and see what we're up to, that he can actually do that. We do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy on our property because we do not own the rights to the air over our property. So that means that drones can fly over people's yards without a search warrant. They can't look at windows, but they can look straight down. And some of these new drones are spectacular. How have they solved the dirt bike problem? Well, when there's a dirt bike zooming around, they send a drone up, and these things are piloted by humans that have actual FAA licenses, but they're able to lock onto a target. So when the pilot finds the dirt bike or any vehicle, it can lock the drone onto that vehicle, and it will follow it until you tell it not to. So there's no getting away from it, right? So I had no idea that their AI was that intelligent, but it is. Another thing he said that is a great use for these, and they're being deployed this way here now, is we had some terrible instances in this country over the last few years. I'm sure going back further than that, where SWAT teams have entered houses and things went wrong, and there was gunplay that perhaps could have been avoided, people getting killed. And speaking to cops that I knew at the time, they were always kind of puzzled by this, because standard operating procedure in most police jurisdictions is that when a team goes into a house, that house is surrounded, and when they breach the front door, floodlights from all around, blinding light comes in, loudspeakers are saying, police, drop your weapons, blah, blah, blah. And there shouldn't be any misunderstanding about whether or not it's police or an intruder coming into your house. It should be pretty obvious. But the thing is, there are some areas where you're in apartment buildings, and that's not as easy to do. And there's also areas where the police don't necessarily follow that procedures. And the worst cases we had in the recent years were when the scenario that I just described is not what played out. So what are we doing here in Hagerstown now? Well, when the police breach a door, they don't go in. They send a drone in to check the place out, which is much, much safer for everybody involved. Because if the people inside misunderstand what's going on and they take a shot at the drone, no harm, no foul, right? You can de-escalate that. You can de-escalate that pretty darn quickly. So the drone goes in and flies around and clears every room one at a time. They send the drone into the next room. And he told us about an incident they had very recently where a guy had It was a domestic dispute. The guy went next door into a different house and went into the house, and he was armed. And the police arrived on the scene. I think it was the SWAT team showed up. They have a different name for it here, but it's basically a SWAT team. And they kicked the door in, but they didn't go in. They sent the drone in, and the drone went all around the house looking for the guy and couldn't find him. And it finally went down into the basement, and the guy was curled up in a fetal position behind the furnace down in the basement. And so the drone banged on the furnace a couple of times to see if he reacted, and he did not. So then they went down there and they used Narcan on him because he had overdosed, and they saved his life. And that's a much better outcome, and that might not have been as easily achievable without the use of a drone. So hats off to our police here in Hagerstown for using technology and all kind. And he talked about lots of other new techniques they're using with more limited resources. So look forward to having more conversations with him in the future. That's all I have for you tonight in the way of the news. I actually didn't have time to check the Methodist news sites tonight. This is an extremely busy week. I am in meetings every I sort of break my day into 3 chunks: morning, afternoon, and evening. And I've got meetings scattered across the chunks all over the week. Morning meetings, evening meetings, afternoon meetings. There isn't a day this week that I'm not somewhere. So if you have a hard time reaching me this week, that's why, but I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, so folks, next week we're going to move on into the kingship of Saul, learn more about his relationship with Samuel, which was not a good one. And I'll look forward to talking to you then. So until next week, God bless, and I'll see you guys either in the sanctuary or online. Let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer. God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen.